Our next presenter is Dr. Adam Murphy. Dr. Murphy is an assistant professor of urology at the Lurie Comprehensive Cancer Center at Northwestern. And he's going to talk to us about his research that studies prostate cancer risk in African American men. And he's recently been looking at the correlation between vitamin D deficiency and prostate cancer risk. He wants to help men understand both what their risk is of developing prostate cancer and also how it is that they can prevent existing cancers from getting worse. So welcome, Dr. Murphy.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. I guess so first of all, thank you for the V Foundation for funding this research, which I think is really important to trying to help reduce disparities for African Americans at risk of prostate cancer. I guess I am going to talk to you about the purpose of why we do this study. I became aware of the fact that biomarkers are great in that they help us kind of detect disease and also spare people who don't have the disease from invasive tests like biopsies. And that's been one of the things that PSA has had a problem with. Prostate-specific antigen has been the key biomarker for detecting prostate cancer. But as we've gone on in time, it's had a higher mandate to not just detect all prostate cancers, but really detect the ones that we care to treat that were potentially lethal and kind of ignore the ones that were indolent or not likely to kill someone in their lifetime. And so one test that helps us to do that is called Prostate Health Index, which has been validated multiple times in American and European populations, mostly comprised of whites, but also several Asian groups have done similar work and shown that it works in their populations as well, but you have to use different cut points for this test. The test on average goes between 0 and 150. And if you use various cut points, you can help people avoid unnecessary biopsies by reducing the number of false positive tests. So we want to see if it is accurate in Black Americans and then to see if the threshold is the same. The reason why I thought that there could be a problem was that the prevalence of prostate cancer is a lot higher in Blacks compared to other racial groups. In whites, the incidence is about 123 per 100,000 for white males, and 19.9 per 100,000 is the mortality rate for prostate cancer. If you compare that to Blacks just to the left, it's the incidence rate, or how often it occurs, is 70% higher. And the mortality rate is about 2.5 times higher. So whenever you have a difference in prevalence, the thresholds you use to detect, call it a positive test, may need to change. So I call this the Goldilocks problem, where you want it just right. So on this top left graph, this is how PSA performs in whites, where you have people with disease in orange. This is the distribution of PSA in white males with prostate cancer that's potentially lethal. And then this is the distribution in green of people who don't have prostate cancer. And if you see here, there's overlap between those two distributions, which makes it's not a perfect separator of the groups. So if you picked a point in the middle of the disease group, you have absolutely no false positives, meaning that every person with a PSA above that level would have prostate cancer that was significant. If you picked a point in the middle of the people without diseases distribution, here, let's say a PSA of 1, you would be able to detect everyone who had the disease, but you'd have a lot of false positive tests as well, meaning people without disease would be recommended to have a prostate biopsy, which is painful and invasive. So we'd like to avoid that. And we have to have this trade-off between detecting enough of the prostate cancers that are significant or potentially lethal, but also avoiding unnecessary biopsies in people without disease, which is this area here. So the Prostate Health Index is a combination of PSA, free PSA, which is its free-floating non-protein bound version, and then a pro-hormone version that's made more by cancer cells called -2 Pro PSA. It's been shown to be more specific in detecting all prostate cancer and potentially lethal prostate cancer, and it's included in the National Comprehensive Cancer Network's prostate cancer screening guidelines at a threshold of 35. So above 35 being people who are test positive who would be referred for a biopsy when they have an elevated PSA less than 10. So I got concerned about guys who come to my clinic as a urologist with elevated PSAs, and I wanted to know for them whether PHI works similarly and better than PSA in detecting potentially lethal prostate cancer in Blacks. And should we continue to use the 35 cutoff that's recommended by the FDA and by the National Comprehensive Cancer Network? So to do this, the V Foundation funded me for 3 years to try and recruit biopsy-naive Black and white men to see if this test worked, to validate its accuracy in Blacks. So we recruited 208 men who had an initial biopsy for their elevated PSA. We got them right on the day that they were getting their biopsy and drew the blood right before it so that the needle wouldn't affect the PSA levels of the PHI test. And we did the same in whites. And then to see how this would affect people who would be screening for prostate cancer, the National Cancer Institute funded a center in Northwestern to do pilot studies where we were able to go into the community and recruit healthy, controlled Black men, actually at a lot of softball games and community events like churches, educational activities. So we recruited 140 Black healthy controls. We did not do the rectal exam in the community, but they did not have prostate cancer, never had an episode of elevated PSA, and they did not have a history of an abnormal rectal exam. So we think these people have really low risk of prostate cancer. The main differences were that the men in the healthy controls were younger on average, and they had a lower rate of family history of prostate cancer, which was expected. So this is kind of our first proof that Prostate Health Index works similarly in Blacks and whites. The red are the African Americans in the biopsy group, and the blue are the whites in the biopsy group. And as you see, as PHI goes up by 10 points, the risk of potentially lethal prostate cancer goes up in a very linear fashion for both Blacks and whites. There seems to be a trend that Blacks maybe have higher levels of prostate cancer that's potentially lethal at each of these groups of 10 for the Prostate Health Index. So there's more prostate cancer in each group of 5. So this is a very busy slide, but I want you to pay attention to the far left part of this table and the far right. The far left is actually what's reported on every report that a patient gets when they get their Prostate Health Index result back. If they'll get a score between 0 and 150, and it will say if their PHI score falls between 0 and 27, they have an about 10% risk of having any cancer. And if you get up to greater than 55, they have a 50% risk of having cancer. Well, compare that to what's happening in Blacks, you'll find that the rates of any prostate cancer, at least in grade group 1 through 5, which is all prostate cancer, is a lot higher by the time you get to 27 to 36. So it's 17 versus 45%. And then if you went to greater than 55, the rate of prostate cancer is 68% in Blacks versus 50% in a mostly white population that is used to report to patients their probability of cancer. So I would say this isn't very accurate for Blacks. For the people who have the potentially lethal prostate cancers, the 2 to 5 prostate cancers, we see that that actually is much more similar to the all prostate cancer in whites, which is reported as the general population here. So essentially, Blacks should expect to have potentially lethal prostate cancer at the same rate that the general population has any type of prostate cancer. This is an accuracy plot, essentially called a receiver operating curve, that shows that the accuracy of prostate health index is, let's say, 64%, and whereas PSA is only 58% accurate. So it is a little bit better than PSA in Blacks. This is the main thrust of this presentation. If you looked at a PSA by itself and the people who are having biopsy, the typical threshold that we use in the US is a PSA greater than 4 will prompt a prostate biopsy. So if you use that in Blacks, it would detect 92.5% of the significant prostate cancers. It would be specific in 9.5%, meaning that it would help 9.5% of men avoid an unnecessary prostate biopsy. And those healthy controls we recruited from the community, 7.4% of these men would have been referred for an unnecessary prostate biopsy. So we spare most controls an unnecessary prostate biopsy with a PSA of 4. When you use Phi after PSA of 4, you could, and we use the FDA threshold of 35, that sensitivity, which is the detection rate, falls to 86% for Blacks. So that means you miss 13.4% of significant tumors in Blacks, which is fairly high to miss 1 out of 7 tumors that could potentially kill someone. And the specificity in this space is really good, though. It's 3 times higher. So you avoid 30% of these biopsies that are unnecessary. This is an interesting trade-off here. If you go to a lower threshold of Phi, I think that we should probably be using a threshold of 28 in Blacks to preserve the detection rate so that you can pick up 92.5% of these tumors that are potentially lethal, just like PSA alone. And you can increase the amount of men who don't need a biopsy by about 70%. You go from 9.5 to 16.5% missing an unnecessary biopsy. And all these numbers only would unnecessarily biopsy 6.6% of controls. So it's safer for the controls to use Phi. It does preserve the accuracy or the detection rate of clinically significant or potentially lethal prostate cancer, and you do spare some more men unnecessary biopsies. So I think that the FDA threshold needs to be lower for Blacks is the take-home point. I would like to thank Stuart Scott for his leadership in cancer research, and of course the V Foundation, and the patients who participated in the community and in the clinics, and really I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Thank you, and I'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy, so much. That was really, there is so much more that we need to know in prostate cancer and with PSA in general, and especially these differences between Black and white men, which will make a difference right away in what goes on clinically in taking care of these patients. So thank you very much for your presentation.